Your sister has 3 beautiful children now. When are you finally going to give me grandchildren, Maya? My mother's voice sliced through the cheerful noise of Thanksgiving dinner like a knife, turning every head at the table toward me and my perceived failure as a woman. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I sat there frozen with my wine glass halfway to my lips, watching the satisfied expression settle across my older sister Diane's face, as she glanced at her 3 children seated around my parents' dining table in their Portland home. The turkey was perfectly browned. The sweet potato casserole steamed invitingly in its ceramic dish. And the judgment hung in the air so thick I could barely breathe through it. My name is Maya Catherine Morrison, and I had just turned 31 years old exactly 2 weeks before that Thanksgiving dinner. For as long as I could remember, I had been the daughter who disappointed everyone simply by existing on a timeline that did not match their expectations. I was the one who made unconventional choices while my older sister Diane walked the path my parents had mapped out with meticulous care and constant approval. She was 35, married to her high school sweetheart Nathan, and apparently the proud mother of 3 children who represented her completion of every maternal milestone my parents valued above all else. I set my wine glass down with deliberate care, feeling the familiar weight of their collective disappointment pressing against my ribs like a physical force. Around the table sat my father Richard, my mother Carol, my sister Diane, her husband Nathan, their 3 children Emma who was 8, Lucas who was 6, and baby Sophia who was just 14 months old, along with my maternal grandmother Helen, my Aunt Susan and my Uncle David. Every single person at that table was looking at me with expressions ranging from pity to amusement to barely concealed contempt for my apparent inability to fulfill what they considered a woman's primary purpose in life. Carol, it really is wonderful how Diane has embraced motherhood. My Aunt Susan chimed in, deliberately avoiding eye contact with me. 3 children by 35 is such a blessing. Some women just have that natural maternal instinct, you know. The emphasis on some women landed exactly as intended, a verbal arrow aimed directly at my perceived deficiency. My mother nodded with such vigor I thought her pearl necklace might break from the motion. Oh, Diane has always been so nurturing, my mother said, her voice dripping with pride. Even when she was young, she talked about wanting a big family. She knew exactly what mattered in life. Career ambitions are fine for some people, but nothing compares to the joy of children. She did not look at me when she said career ambitions, but she might as well have pointed directly at my face. Everyone at the table understood the subtext perfectly. I was 31 years old, unmarried, childless, and apparently selfishly focused on my career as a wildlife conservation biologist instead of fulfilling my biological destiny and providing my parents with the grandchildren they felt entitled to receive from both their daughters. Well, some of us take longer to find the right partner, my grandmother Helen said, attempting what she probably thought was a helpful intervention. Maya still has time. She is not exactly past her prime yet, though the clock is certainly ticking. Past my prime. The clock is ticking. I had heard these phrases and their variations approximately 1,000 times since turning 28. My family spoke about my reproductive system, as though it were a bomb with a visible countdown timer, threatening to explode and take all their grandparent dreams with it into barren oblivion. That's very true, Grandma Helen, Diane said with practiced sweetness, reaching over to wipe mashed potatoes from baby Sophia's chin. I'm sure Maya will settle down eventually, although I do worry that she has spent so much time in remote research locations that she might have forgotten how to connect with people in normal situations. Conservation work is important, I suppose, but it does not exactly lead to meeting potential husbands. The condescension in her voice was so familiar I barely registered it anymore. Diane had perfected this particular tone over decades of practice, the ability to deliver cutting criticism, while maintaining a veneer of sisterly concern that made any objection seem like overreaction or paranoia on my part. Diane makes an excellent point, my father Richard said, cutting into his turkey with surgical precision. Maya, you have been gallivanting around studying animals for years now. At some point you need to think about your future. Real stability comes from family, not from chasing bears through the wilderness or whatever it is you do. Chasing bears through the wilderness. That was how my father characterized my doctoral research on gray wolf population dynamics and ecosystem impacts, work that had been published in peer-reviewed journals, and cited by conservation policymakers across 3 states. To him, it was the equivalent of an extended camping trip that prevented me from focusing on what really mattered, which was apparently getting married and producing offspring as quickly as biologically possible. "I study wolves actually, Dad," I said quietly. "Not bears. And I'm not chasing them. I'm conducting research that informs conservation policy and helps maintain ecosystem balance." My mother waved her hand dismissively, as though the distinction between bears and wolves was irrelevant trivia that missed the larger point entirely. "Animals, Maya. You study animals. That's lovely as a hobby. But what about your personal life? Look at your sister. She has built something real. She has a husband who adores her, 3 beautiful healthy children, and a home filled with love and laughter. What do you have? Research papers that no one outside academia will ever read, and a small apartment that you are barely in half the year because you are always traveling to some remote field station?" The words landed like slaps, each one carefully aimed to highlight my perceived inadequacy. My small apartment, my constant travel, my lack of husband and children, my failure to build something real, as though the work I had dedicated my adult life to was somehow imaginary or inconsequential because it did not involve pregnancy and childbirth. I looked around the table at faces that should have shown me unconditional love and support, but instead reflected only judgment and disappointment. My mother Carol, with her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer cardigan, had always measured her daughter's worth by how well they conformed to traditional expectations. My father Richard, successful in his own right as a commercial real estate developer, valued visible conventional achievements like marriage certificates and birth announcements over accomplishments he could not easily explain to his golf partners. And Diane, Golden Perfect Diane, had learned early that the fastest route to parental approval was complete conformity to their values. She had married young, started having children immediately, and built her entire identity around being the ideal mother and wife. Her children were well behaved, her marriage appeared stable, and her social media presence was a carefully curated highlight reel of family perfection that my mother showed to her friends with unconcealed pride. But they did not know the truth about my life. They did not know about the choices I had made or the circumstances I had been navigating for the past 7 months. They did not know that while they pitied me for my childless state, I had been living a reality so different from their assumptions that the gap between perception and truth had become a chasm wide enough to swallow their entire narrative about my failures as a woman. I took a deep breath and reached for my wine glass again, taking a long slow sip while I considered my options. For years, I had absorbed this treatment with quiet dignity, refusing to defend myself because I knew from experience that my accomplishments would be dismissed or minimized regardless of how I presented them. I had learned that sharing good news with my family was an exercise in futility that left me feeling worse than if I had said nothing at all. "You know what concerns me most?" my mother continued, apparently determined to extract every possible ounce of shame from this conversation. "At your age, Diane already had Emma and was pregnant with Lucas. You have not even managed to maintain a serious relationship. That researcher you were seeing, what was his name? The one who studied birds?" "James," I said quietly. "He studied migratory patterns in raptors. We broke up 2 years ago because he accepted a position in Alaska and I was committed to my research here in the Pacific Northwest." "See, that's exactly what I mean," my father interjected, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. "You prioritize your work over relationships. You let a perfectly good man go because you could not be flexible about location. How do you expect to build a life with someone if you are not willing to compromise?" The irony of this criticism coming from a man who had expected my mother to move 6 times during his career for his job opportunities was apparently lost on everyone at the table. When men prioritized careers, it was ambition and drive. When women did the same, it was selfishness and poor priorities, particularly if those women had functioning reproductive systems that were not being utilized to produce grandchildren. "Maybe Maya is one of those women who just does not want children," my Uncle David suggested, attempting to sound progressive and understanding. "That's becoming more acceptable now, I hear. Some people choose careers over family." His tone made it clear that while this choice might be becoming more acceptable in broader society, it remained deeply unacceptable at this particular table. The idea that a woman might actively choose not to have children rather than simply failing to achieve that goal was somehow even more threatening to their worldview. Oh, I'm sure Maya wants children eventually, Diane said, bouncing baby Sophia on her lap. She probably just needs to get her priorities straight first. Although I will say the longer you wait, the harder it gets. I had such an easy time with all 3 pregnancies. Barely any morning sickness, straightforward deliveries, and all 3 children were healthy from day 1. Nathan and I were so blessed. She emphasized the word blessed as though her reproductive success was evidence of divine favor, implicitly suggesting that my childless state reflected some cosmic judgment on my life choices. This was vintage Diane, packaging her superiority in the language of gratitude and humility, while ensuring everyone understood exactly how much better she was than me in every measurable way. Well, some of us are not as lucky, my grandmother Helen said, reaching over to pat my hand in what she probably intended as comfort but felt more like condolence at a funeral. Your biological clock is definitely ticking, dear. If you wait much longer, you might miss your chance entirely. Fertility drops dramatically after 35, you know. You only have a few years left. A few years left. As though my ovaries had an expiration date stamped on them like milk in a grocery store. And once that date passed, I would transform from a potentially viable woman into expired goods that should be removed from the shelf entirely. I felt the anger rising in my chest, hot and insistent, demanding release after years of suppression. The same anger I had been swallowing at family gatherings since my mid-20s when the questions about my relationship status had first begun escalating into interrogations about my reproductive plans. The anger that came from being reduced to my biological functions and found wanting because I had not yet produced offspring to validate my existence. But alongside the anger was something else, something new. A calm certainty that I did not have to continue accepting their narrative about my life. I did not have to keep protecting them from the truth to avoid conflict or maintain peace. I did not have to continue pretending that their assessment of my failures was accurate when I knew it was based on incomplete information and assumptions they had never bothered to verify. Actually, I said, setting my wine glass down with enough force that the stem clicked against the wooden table, I do have some news about children. The table fell silent. My mother looked at me with an expression of cautious hope mixed with deep skepticism, as though expecting me to announce I had started volunteering at a daycare center or adopted a particularly needy houseplant. Diane tilted her head with obvious curiosity, clearly anticipating some announcement that would provide fresh material for her condescension. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Oh, my father said, his tone suggesting he expected disappointment. What kind of news? I took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment. For 7 months, I had kept the most significant development of my entire life private from my family, not because I was ashamed but because I knew with absolute certainty that they would find some way to minimize it, criticize my choices around it, or use it as fresh ammunition for their ongoing campaign to make me feel inadequate. But their question had created an opening. When are you finally going to give me grandchildren? My mother had asked this question in front of the entire family, using it as a weapon to humiliate me and highlight my perceived failures. She had made this conversation public and confrontational. She had demanded an answer. And for the first time in my adult life, I was ready to give her one. Well, I said slowly, savoring the moment before everything changed. Since you asked about grandchildren, Mom, I thought you might want to know that you actually became a grandmother to 2 more babies back in May. The confusion on their faces was immediate and profound. My mother's fork clattered against her plate. Diane's expression shifted from smugness to complete bewilderment. My father leaned forward as though he had not heard correctly. What are you talking about? My mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I had twins in May, I said, my voice steady and clear. A boy and a girl. Oliver and Stella. They are 7 months old now. Beautiful, healthy, and absolutely perfect. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in my parents' living room 2 rooms away. Every person at the table stared at me as though I had just announced I was actually an alien from another planet who had been studying human behavior as part of an elaborate interspecies research project. You what? Diane finally managed, her voice strangled and disbelieving. I had twins, I repeated calmly. 7 months ago. In May. That's usually what people mean when they say they had children, right? Or did I misunderstand the question about when I was going to give you grandchildren? My mother's face had gone completely white. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish gasping on a dock, but no sound emerged. My father sat frozen in his chair, his expression suggesting he was trying to process information that simply refused to compute. "That's impossible," Diane said flatly. "You were not pregnant. We saw you at Easter, and you certainly were not pregnant then." "Easter was in April," I said. "I was absolutely pregnant then. 36 weeks pregnant, actually. But you were all so busy discussing your plans for Lucas's soccer season and Emma's piano recital that none of you bothered to look at me closely enough to notice." This was not entirely true. I had been wearing oversized layers specifically chosen to conceal my pregnancy because I had known with certainty that announcing it to my family would result in exactly the kind of intrusive questioning and judgment I had no interest in managing while dealing with the physical and emotional challenges of carrying twins. But they did not need to know that I had deliberately hidden it. The point was that they had been so convinced of my inadequacy, and so uninterested in my actual life, that they had completely failed to see what was happening right in front of them. "Where are they?" my grandmother demanded, looking around as though expecting two infants to materialize from the walls. "Where are these supposed twins?" "With their father," I said. "We alternate holiday hosting. This year Thanksgiving is with my family, and Christmas will be with his. Next year we will reverse it. Co-parenting requires coordination and planning, which we have been managing quite effectively for the past 7 months. Thank you for asking." The questions came rapid-fire after that, tumbling over each other in a cacophony of disbelief and confusion. Who was the father? Where did he come from? Why had I not told anyone? How was I managing work and children? Where was I living? When had I gotten pregnant? Why had I hidden it? How could I have kept something so significant secret from my entire family? I sat back in my chair and watched them spiral into chaos, their carefully constructed narrative about my failures and inadequacies crumbling around them like a sandcastle hit by an unexpected wave. For 7 months, they had continued treating me like a disappointing child who could not get her life together, while I had been navigating the most challenging and transformative experience of my life completely alone by choice, because I had known they could not be trusted to support me without judgment or unwanted interference. And now, finally, I was ready to tell them exactly why I had made that choice and what it said about the family dynamics that had shaped my entire adult life. "Let me explain something to you," I said, my voice cutting through the confusion. "I kept my pregnancy and my children secret from this family because you have spent the last decade making it abundantly clear that nothing I do will ever be good enough for you. I did not tell you because I knew you would criticize every choice I made, from who I chose as a father to how I managed work to whether I was breastfeeding or using formula. I did not tell you because I wanted to experience the joy of becoming a mother without your constant judgment raining down on me like acid." My mother finally found her voice, though it came out thin and wounded. "Maya, how could you think we would not be supportive? We are your family." "Are you?" I asked. "Because families typically celebrate each other's accomplishments instead of dismissing them. Families ask questions about each other's lives with genuine interest instead of just waiting for opportunities to deliver criticism. Families notice when someone is pregnant with twins instead of being so absorbed in their own narratives that they miss something that's significant." The truth hung in the air between us, sharp and undeniable. For years, I had been invisible to them except as a source of disappointment. Now I had pulled back the curtain on their assumptions and revealed a reality they had never imagined. And we were all going to have to deal with the consequences of that revelation, whether they liked it or not. The shock on their faces should have brought me satisfaction, but instead I felt a hollow exhaustion settling into my bones. This moment had been inevitable from the second my mother asked that question about grandchildren, and yet watching my family grapple with information that contradicted everything they believed about me brought no triumph, only a weary recognition that we had arrived at a crossroads that had been years in the making. My Aunt Susan was the first to recover enough to form a coherent sentence. "Maya, this is absolutely absurd. You cannot possibly expect us to believe that you had twins 7 months ago, and never told anyone in this family. That would be unnatural. Mothers want to share that kind of news with their families. Most mothers have families they can trust to be supportive," I said evenly. "I did not have that luxury, so I made different choices." That's incredibly unfair, Diane protested, though her voice carried less certainty than usual. She was still processing the revelation, still trying to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with this version who had apparently been living an entirely separate life. We would have thrown you a baby shower. We would have helped you prepare. We would have been there for you. Would you? I asked, turning to face her directly. Would you really? Or would you have spent the entire pregnancy questioning my choices, criticizing my decision to continue my research work, and making passive-aggressive comments about whether I was ready for motherhood since I had spent so long avoiding it? Diane opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. We both knew the answer to that question, even if she was not ready to admit it out loud. I let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. This pattern did not start with my pregnancy. This has been going on my entire adult life. Every accomplishment I have achieved has been minimized or dismissed because it did not fit your narrow definition of what success should look like for a woman. And I am tired of pretending that your treatment of me has been fair or reasonable. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unhappy with the direction this conversation was taking. He had always preferred to avoid emotional confrontations, treating family dysfunction as something that would resolve itself if everyone just stopped talking about it and focused on being pleasant. Maya, I think you are being overly dramatic, he said, employing his favorite dismissal technique. Every family has disagreements about life choices. That does not mean we do not love you or support you. Let me tell you about support, Dad, I said, my voice remaining calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Do you remember when I got accepted into the doctoral program at Oregon State? I called you from the field station where I was working, so excited I could barely speak. I had been competing against candidates from across the country, and I got full funding for 5 years of research. Do you remember what you said? My father frowned, clearly not recalling the conversation that had been seared into my memory like a brand. I am sure I congratulated you. You said, and I quote, "That's nice, honey, but do not you think you are getting a little old to still be in school? Your sister already has a real career and a family. When are you going to start thinking about settling down?" I watched his expression shift as the memory surfaced. That was your response to one of the biggest achievements of my life. Not congratulations. Not pride. Just disappointment that I was not following Diane's path. My mother made a small sound of protest, but I continued before she could interrupt. And Mom, do you remember my 28th birthday? I had just published my first major research paper in a top-tier conservation journal, the kind of publication that early career researchers dream about because it establishes credibility in the field. I was so proud, and I made the mistake of mentioning it during dinner. I am sure we were very proud, my mother said, though her voice lacked conviction. You smiled vaguely and said, "That's wonderful, dear," then immediately changed the subject to tell everyone that Diane was pregnant with Lucas. You spent the next 45 minutes discussing baby names and nursery colors. You never asked a single question about my research or what the publication meant for my career. It was like I had not spoken at all. The examples kept coming, each one a small cut that had accumulated over the years into a wound that never quite healed because new injuries kept reopening it before it could scar over properly. I remember being 25 and receiving a competitive grant that funded 2 years of fieldwork studying wolfpack dynamics in Eastern Oregon. My mother had responded by asking if I had considered getting a teaching position instead because at least teachers had regular schedules that would allow time for dating and eventually starting a family. The grant that dozens of researchers had competed for, the funding that validated my research proposal and methodology, meant nothing to her compared to the hypothetical possibility that a different career might lead me toward the marriage and motherhood she valued above all else. I remember being 27 and presenting my preliminary dissertation research at a national conservation conference in Denver. I had been selected to give a plenary talk, a significant honor for a graduate student that indicated my work was making an impact in the field. When I called to share the news, my father asked how much the conference would cost and whether it might be better to save that money for more practical purposes. He did not ask what my research was about or why it mattered. He saw only an expense rather than an achievement. I remember being 29 and successfully defending my dissertation, earning my doctorate after years of intensive research and writing. I had invited my family to attend the defense, knowing they probably would not come but hoping that maybe this time would be different. Diane had sent a text message that morning saying she could not make it because Lucas had a soccer game. My parents had not responded to the invitation at all. They called 3 days later to ask if I was finished with school now and ready to think about my future, as though the doctorate I had just earned was not an investment in my future but rather a prolonged delay of the real business of finding a husband. Each individual incident could be rationalized or explained away. They were busy. They did not understand my field. They meant well but expressed it poorly. But taken together, the pattern was undeniable. My accomplishments were consistently treated as less important, less impressive, and less worthy of celebration than anything Diane did, no matter how objectively significant my achievements were or how routine hers might be. You have never once asked me about my work with genuine curiosity, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. Not once in 10 years have you asked what I actually do in the field, what my research has discovered, or why it matters for conservation policy. You have reduced my entire career to studying animals as though it were an eccentric hobby rather than a legitimate scientific discipline that informs environmental management decisions across multiple states. My Uncle David cleared his throat uncomfortably. To be fair, Maya, most of us do not really understand what wildlife biologists do. It is pretty specialized work. That is exactly my point, I said, turning toward him. You do not understand and you have never made any effort to understand. But you do not need to understand the technical details to show basic respect and interest. You could ask questions. You could listen when I try to explain. You could acknowledge that just because something is outside your area of expertise does not mean it lacks value or significance. I thought about the countless times I had tried to share aspects of my work with my family, only to watch their eyes glaze over with disinterest or see them change the subject at the first opportunity. I had learned to stop talking about the things that mattered most to me because doing so in their presence only highlighted how little they cared about the substance of my life. Meanwhile, Diane could spend an hour describing the details of Emma's dance recital costume or Lucas's performance in a school play, and everyone would listen with rapt attention, asking follow-up questions and expressing enthusiastic support. The disparity was not about the inherent interest level of the topics being discussed. It was about whose life my family considered worth paying attention to. Your sister's life is more relatable, my grandmother Helen said, as though this explained everything. Children and family are universal experiences that everyone can connect with. Research about wolves is just more niche. Relatable to whom? I asked. You have decided that Diane's choices are more valuable, because they align with traditional expectations for women. But my work affects the lives of thousands of people who depend on healthy ecosystems for their livelihoods. The research I do informs policies that protect endangered species and maintain biodiversity. That matters even if you cannot see how it directly impacts your daily life. The conversation was spiraling in directions I had not anticipated, but I found myself unable to stop. Years of suppressed frustration were pouring out now that I had finally opened the door. And there was something cathartic about naming the patterns that had shaped my relationship with my family for so long. Let me tell you what it has been like to be me in this family, I said, looking around the table at faces that reflected various degrees of discomfort, defensiveness, and dawning recognition. From the moment Diane got married at 24, I have been evaluated solely based on my failure to follow her timeline. Every family gathering became an interrogation about my relationship status. Every holiday included pointed comments about my biological clock. Every accomplishment I achieved was immediately followed by questions about when I would settle down and start a real life. We were concerned about you, my mother said, her voice taking on the martyred tone she used when she wanted to reframe criticism as care. We wanted you to be happy. And we worried that you were so focused on your career that you would miss out on the things that really matter. The things that really matter to you, I corrected. You decided that marriage and children were the only valid measures of a woman's success, and you judged me as a failure because I did not prioritize those things on your timeline. But you never once asked if I was happy with my life. You never considered that maybe I found fulfillment in my work, in contributing to scientific knowledge, in protecting species that cannot protect themselves. I paused, letting the words settle before continuing. And the cruelest part is that even when I did have children, even when I achieved the thing you claim to value above all else, you were so convinced of my inadequacy that you did not even notice. I was pregnant with twins, visibly pregnant if anyone had bothered to actually look at me. And not a single person in this family saw it because you were all too busy feeling superior and disappointed to pay attention to my actual reality. Diane had been uncharacteristically quiet during this recitation, but now she spoke up, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. I noticed you were wearing baggy clothes at Easter. I thought you had gained weight and were sensitive about it, so I did not say anything. You thought I had gained weight, I repeated slowly, and your response was to say nothing but silently judge me for it, while continuing to talk about your own children's accomplishments? She flushed red, unable to meet my eyes. I did not want to embarrass you, but you had no problem embarrassing me tonight by participating in Mom's public interrogation about my childless status? You had no problem making snide comments about how I have spent so much time in remote locations that I have forgotten how to connect with people? That kind of embarrassment was perfectly acceptable? The double standard was so glaring that even Diane seemed to recognize it, though recognition did not immediately translate into accountability. She looked down at her plate, absently cutting her turkey into smaller and smaller pieces without eating any of it. My father made another attempt to regain control of the conversation and steer it back toward comfortable territory. I think we are getting off track here. Maya, we are all very surprised to learn about your children, and obviously we have questions. But attacking your family is not productive. We love you, even if we have not always shown it in ways you appreciate. Love without respect is not enough, Dad, I said quietly. I have always known you loved me in some abstract sense. But love means nothing when it comes packaged with constant judgment and dismissal. Love means nothing when the person being loved has to hide the most important developments in their life, because they know the people who claim to love them cannot be trusted to respond with support instead of criticism. The truth of this statement hung heavy in the air. My grandmother was dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, though whether from genuine emotion or performative distress was unclear. My aunt and uncle were studying their plates with sudden intense fascination, clearly uncomfortable with the level of honesty being expressed but unable to leave without making the situation even more awkward. I think what your mother was trying to say, my father attempted again, is that we wish you had trusted us enough to share this news. We would have wanted to be part of your pregnancy journey. Would you? I challenged. Let me paint you a picture of what that would have looked like. When I told you I was pregnant, your first questions would have been about the father. Who is he? How long have you known him? Why had I never mentioned him before? Is he educated? Does he have a stable career? Are we getting married? I could see from their expressions that I had accurately predicted their response, which only proved my point. When I explained that we were not married and had no plans to marry, you would have expressed deep disappointment and concern about raising children in a non-traditional family structure. Mom would have worried about what her friends would think. Dad would have questioned whether this man was really committed if he was not willing to marry me. Grandma would have talked about how things were different in her day, and how children need married parents. My grandmother started to protest, but I held up my hand. Then you would have started questioning every decision I made during the pregnancy. You would have criticized me for continuing my fieldwork during my first trimester. You would have panicked about me living alone without a husband to take care of me. You would have suggested I move back home or at least move closer to you. You would have offered unsolicited advice about everything from prenatal vitamins to childbirth classes to whether I should find out the baby's genders in advance. I was on a roll now, years of imagined conversations pouring out. When I went into labor, you would have been hurt that I did not call you immediately. You would have wanted to be in the delivery room, despite me specifically not wanting an audience during one of the most vulnerable moments of my life. You would have showed up at the hospital uninvited, and then complained when you were not allowed in. You would have taken it personally instead of respecting my boundaries. My mother's face had gone through several emotional transitions during this monologue, settling finally on a mixture of hurt and defensiveness that suggested I had hit closer to truth than she wanted to acknowledge. After the twins were born, I continued, you would have descended on my home with constant visits and endless advice. You would have criticized how I was feeding them, how I was dressing them, how I was managing their sleep schedules. You would have compared everything I did to how Diane did it, implying constantly that her way was correct and mine was questionable. You would have made me feel incompetent and inadequate during a time when I desperately needed confidence and support. That is not fair, Diane finally said, finding her voice again. You are assuming the worst about all of us based on hypotheticals. Am I, though? I asked. Is anything I just described inconsistent with how this family has treated me for the past decade? Have I invented this pattern out of nothing, or am I simply acknowledging what has been obvious to me for years? The silence that followed was answer enough. They could not honestly deny that my predictions were accurate, because we all knew they were based on extensive experience with exactly this kind of treatment. I had not imagined the dismissal and judgment. I had lived it repeatedly, and I had made the reasonable decision to protect myself and my children from experiencing more of it. I made a choice, I said, my voice softening slightly. I chose to experience pregnancy and early motherhood without your involvement, because I knew from years of experience that your involvement would make it harder rather than easier. I chose to protect my children from being used as weapons in whatever dysfunctional dynamic this family has going on. And I chose to protect myself from having what should have been a joyful experience turned into another opportunity for you all to find me lacking. My mother was crying now. Genuine tears that might have moved me if I had not spent so many years being manipulated by her emotional displays. She had always been skilled at positioning herself as the victim in any conflict, transforming justified criticism of her behavior into evidence that she was being unfairly attacked by an ungrateful daughter. How can you say such cruel things? She asked through her tears. We have always tried to do what was best for you. We have always wanted you to be happy. You have wanted me to be happy in exactly the way you defined happiness, I corrected gently. You have wanted me to want what you wanted for me. But you have never accepted that I might have a different vision for my life, and you have never stopped punishing me for failing to conform to your expectations. The Thanksgiving dinner that had started with such traditional warmth had completely dissolved into this uncomfortable confrontation. The food was getting cold on our plates. The children, sensing the tension among the adults, had grown quiet and watchful. Baby Sophia had started fussing in Diane's arms, picking up on her mother's distress. I think we need to take a break, my Aunt Susan suggested, clearly desperate to escape the intensity of the conversation. Perhaps we should clear the table and have some coffee. Give everyone time to process. But I was not finished. Not yet. There was more they needed to hear. More truth that needed to be spoken before we could even begin to figure out what kind of relationship might be salvageable from the wreckage of their assumptions about my life. There is something else you need to understand, I said, my voice cutting through the movement toward escape. I did not tell you about Oliver and Stella because I did not trust you to celebrate them for who they are rather than seeing them as vindication of your belief that motherhood was what I needed to finally become acceptable in your eyes. My children are not proof that you were right about what I should want. They are simply human beings who deserve to be welcomed into a family that will love them unconditionally, not held up as evidence in some long-running argument about whose life choices are more valid. This distinction seemed to genuinely surprise them, as though it had never occurred to any of them that I might object not just to how they had treated me, but to how they might treat my children. Of course we would love your children, my grandmother protested. They are family. Are they? I asked. Or would they be evaluated and compared and found wanting just like I have been? Would Oliver be questioned about why he is not as athletic as Lucas? Would Stella be criticized for not being as social as Emma? Would every developmental milestone be measured against Diane's children, and used as evidence that my parenting is inferior? The questions landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread across the table. Because we all knew that yes, that was exactly what would happen. The pattern that had defined my relationship with this family would inevitably extend to my children, unless something fundamental changed. And that change, I was beginning to realize, was not going to come from them. It was going to have to come from me, from my willingness to set boundaries and enforce them, from my refusal to continue accepting treatment that diminished me and would eventually diminish my children if I allowed them to be absorbed into these toxic dynamics. The Thanksgiving I had driven 3 hours to attend was turning into something I had not fully anticipated, a reckoning that had been building for years and could no longer be avoided or smoothed over with polite silence. The coffee that my Aunt Susan had suggested never materialized. Instead, we all remained frozen in our positions around the dining table, the remnants of our Thanksgiving meal growing cold as the weight of my revelations settled over the room like heavy fog. My mother had stopped crying but sat dabbing at her eyes with a cloth napkin, her carefully applied makeup now smudged and streaked. My father looked like a man who had walked into a room expecting one conversation and found himself in the middle of something entirely different and far more complicated. But beneath my own anger and frustration, beneath the years of accumulated resentment that I had finally allowed myself to express, there was something else entirely. A reality so different from what they imagined that the gap between their perception and the truth felt almost comical. They saw me as someone who had finally stumbled into motherhood, after years of disappointing them with my unconventional choices. They had no idea what my life actually looked like or what I had been building, while they dismissed me as a wayward daughter who refused to grow up and accept adult responsibilities. I think, I said slowly, considering my words carefully, that before we go any further, you all need to understand exactly what you have been missing while you were so busy being disappointed in me. Diane looked up from her plate, confusion and wariness mixing in her expression. What do you mean? I mean that your entire understanding of my life is based on assumptions rather than reality. You have spent years constructing a narrative about who I am and what I am doing, and you have never once bothered to verify whether that narrative is accurate. My father shifted in his chair, his discomfort evident. Maya, we know you do research and that you travel for work. We understand the basics of your career. Do you? I challenged. Tell me, Dad, where do you think I live? He frowned at the question, clearly uncertain why it mattered but willing to play along. You have an apartment downtown. You mentioned it is small but close to the university. I did have an apartment downtown, I corrected. I lived there during graduate school and for 2 years after finishing my doctorate. But I have not lived there for 3 years. I own a home now. A 4-bedroom house in the West Hills with views of Mount Hood on clear days and enough land that deer regularly wander through my backyard. The surprise on their faces was almost satisfying. My mother actually gasped, her hand flying to her throat as though I had announced something scandalous rather than simply revealing a basic fact about my living situation. You own a house? My grandmother asked, her voice filled with disbelief. How could you afford that on a researcher's salary? This was the question I had been waiting for. The one that revealed exactly how little they understood about my professional life and the choices I had made over the past decade. They had assumed that because I worked in academia and conservation, I must be struggling financially, barely scraping by on grant funding and adjunct teaching positions like so many early career researchers. They had never asked about the specifics of my work or how I supported myself because they had already decided they knew the answer. That is an excellent question, Grandma, I said. And the answer is going to surprise you. I did not buy my house on a researcher's salary. I bought it with the income one generate from my consulting work. Consulting work? My Uncle David leaned forward with sudden interest. What kind of consulting? Environmental impact consulting for development projects, I explained. My research on wolf populations and ecosystem dynamics made me an expert in predator-prey relationships and how development affects wildlife corridors and habitat connectivity. Companies that want to build in areas with sensitive ecosystems need environmental impact assessments before they can get permits. I assess those impacts, recommend mitigation strategies, and help them design projects that minimize harm to wildlife populations while still meeting their development goals. I watched their faces as they processed this information, saw them struggling to reconcile this version of my work with the vague notion they had held about me studying animals in the wilderness. I started doing consulting work during my final year of graduate school, I continued. A former professor connected me with a development company that needed expertise on how their proposed resort would affect local wolf populations. I did the assessment as a side project, and they paid me more for 2 months of consulting than I had earned in the previous year as a graduate research assistant. The numbers were substantial enough that saying them out loud still gave me a small thrill of satisfaction. I had gone from barely covering rent and groceries to having more money than I knew what to do with, all because I possessed specialized knowledge that had significant commercial value outside academia. After that first project, word spread quickly in the industry, I said. Developers need environmental assessments, and they want consultants who understand both the science and the regulatory requirements. I built a reputation for being thorough, practical, and able to find solutions that satisfied both conservation concerns and development interests. Within a year of finishing my doctorate, I had more consulting offers than I could possibly accept. My father was staring at me as though seeing me clearly for the first time in years. How much does this consulting work pay? Last year I earned just over $400,000. I said simply. This year will be higher because I have had to turn down fewer projects now that I have established systems and can work more efficiently. The silence that followed this revelation was profound and electric. $400,000. The number hung in the air between us, impossible to dismiss or minimize. That was not struggling researcher money. That was not barely getting by money. That was successful professional money, the kind that bought houses in desirable neighborhoods and provided financial security that most people spent their entire careers working toward. That cannot be right, my mother said weakly. You said you do research. You work in the field with wolves. I do both, I explained patiently. I maintain my research because it is my passion and because it keeps my expertise current, which makes me more valuable as a consultant. But the consulting work is what pays my bills and then some. I typically spend about 4 months a year doing fieldwork and research, which I can afford to do because the other 8 months generate more than enough income to support both my lifestyle and my research. Diane had gone very quiet, her expression unreadable. I knew what she was thinking because I knew exactly how much her husband Nathan earned as a mid-level manager at an insurance company. Their household income was comfortable, sufficient to afford their mortgage and support their children, but it was nowhere near what I was describing. The sister they had pitted for her unconventional career choices was significantly out-earning their dual-income traditional household. Why would you keep something like that secret? My Aunt Susan asked, genuine confusion in her voice. That is a remarkable achievement. You should be proud. I am proud, I said. But I stopped sharing my professional successes with this family years ago because every time I tried, the accomplishments were either dismissed as unimportant or immediately followed by questions about why I was not using my apparent success to settle down and start a family. I thought back to the last time I had attempted to share good news with them, about 3 years earlier when I had purchased my house. I had called my mother, excited to tell her about the offer I had made and the negotiations that had resulted in me getting exactly the property I wanted at a price below asking because the sellers valued my promise to maintain the wildlife-friendly landscaping they had carefully developed. My mother had listened to about 2 minutes of my explanation before interrupting to ask whether I really needed such a large house when I was living alone. Would it not make more sense to buy a smaller place and save the difference? Or better yet, to continue renting and save toward a house that I could buy with a future husband once I finally settled down? The implication was clear. My success was premature, my choices questioned, my excitement deflated before I had even finished describing the property. I had hung up that call and made a decision. I would stop trying to share my life with people who refused to celebrate it. I would build my success quietly, for myself and on my own terms, without seeking validation from people who were determined not to provide it. Let me tell you what else you do not know about my life, I said, warming to the subject now that I had started revealing the truth. You do not know that I serve on 2 conservation advisory boards that influence state wildlife policy. You do not know that I was invited to present my research at an international conference in Vancouver last year, or that my work has been cited in over 40 peer-reviewed publications by other researchers. You do not know that I was featured in a documentary about wolf conservation that aired on a major streaming platform, though I used my maiden name in the credits so you would not have recognized me even if you had watched it. Each fact landed like a small explosion, disrupting the narrative they had constructed about my life. My grandmother was shaking her head slowly, as though trying to physically dislodge the cognitive dissonance of reconciling this new information with her long-held beliefs about my inadequate life choices. You do not know these things because you never asked, I continued. You decided who I was and what my life looked like, and you never questioned whether your assumptions were accurate. You saw my fieldwork and assumed I was barely employed. You saw my focus on my career and assumed I was lonely and unfulfilled. You saw my lack of husband and children and concluded that I was somehow failing at life, when in reality I was building exactly the life I wanted. My father cleared his throat, clearly struggling with this revised understanding of his younger daughter. If you were doing so well, why did you let us think otherwise? Why did you not correct our misunderstanding? Because I tried, Dad. I said, my voice tinged with the exhaustion of years spent fighting this battle. I tried so many times to share what was happening in my life, and every single time you either dismissed it or found a way to turn it into evidence that I needed to change course. After a while, I realized that you did not want to know the truth about my life. You wanted me to confirm your disappointment so you could continue feeling superior through Diane and concerned about me. This assessment was harsh but accurate, and I could see from their expressions that at least some of them recognized the truth in it. They had needed me to be the problem child, the daughter who made questionable choices, because it made Diane's conventional path look even more correct by comparison. My failure was essential to their narrative about the right way to live a life. And the father of your children? Diane asked, her voice carefully controlled. I assume he is also someone we know nothing about? His name is Marcus Holloway, I said. He is a wildlife veterinarian specializing in large carnivores. We met 6 years ago at a conference on predator conservation. We have been partners in both work and life ever since, though not in the traditional married sense that you all seem to think is the only valid form of commitment. I had anticipated this question and had my answer prepared. Marcus was not a secret, but he was also not someone I had ever introduced to my family precisely because I knew they would judge our relationship by their conventional standards and find it lacking. Marcus and I work together frequently, I explained. He provides veterinary support for my research projects, and I provide ecological expertise for his rehabilitation work with injured wolves and other large predators. We bought our house together, we share financial responsibilities, and we are raising our children together as full partners. We are simply not married and have no plans to marry because neither of us sees the value in a legal ceremony that would not change anything about our actual relationship or commitment to each other. My mother looked physically pained by this description, as though my explanation of a loving committed partnership was somehow more offensive than if I had announced the children were the result of a brief affair with someone I barely knew. But the children need married parents, she protested weakly. What kind of stability can you provide if you are not even married? The kind of stability that comes from two adults who have built a life together intentionally and thoughtfully rather than rushing into marriage because that is what was expected of them, I said. Marcus and I have been together for 6 years. We own property together. We have joint accounts and shared investments. We have created legal documents ensuring we both have parental rights and medical decision-making authority for each other and our children. We have done everything that marriage would provide except sign a piece of paper that would satisfy your need for conventional markers of commitment. This was the truth, though not the complete truth. Marcus and I had discussed marriage several times over the years, and we had ultimately decided that for us the legal status was less important than the actual substance of our relationship. We had the commitment, the partnership, the shared vision for our future. We did not need a wedding to make any of that more real. Where is he now? My Uncle David asked. Why did he not come with you today? He is at his parents' home in Bend with Oliver and Stella, I said. His family has been wonderful throughout my pregnancy and these first 7 months of the twins' lives. They respect our choices, they celebrate our successes, and they treat me as a full member of their family, rather than as someone who needs to be fixed or reformed. They threw us a baby shower before the twins were born. They visited us in the hospital. They help with childcare when we both need to work. They do all the things that families are supposed to do for each other. The comparison was deliberate and pointed. Marcus's parents had provided the support and celebration that my own family had not, precisely because I had not given my family the opportunity to fail me again. I had chosen to protect myself and my children by building our support system outside my biological family, and that choice had proven correct over and over again in the months since Oliver and Stella had been born. So you have just written us off completely? Diane asked, hurt evident in her voice. You decided we were not worth including in your life? I did not write you off, I corrected. I made a strategic decision about where to invest my emotional energy and who to trust with the most vulnerable moments of my life. You all spent years proving that you could not be trusted to support my choices without judgment. So when I faced the biggest transition of my life, I chose to surround myself with people who had actually demonstrated their ability to be supportive. This was the heart of it, the decision that had shaped everything about how I had managed my pregnancy and early motherhood. I had not kept secrets out of spite or to punish my family for their past behavior. I had kept secrets to protect myself and my children from the predictable patterns that had characterized our relationship for years. Let me describe what the past 7 months have actually looked like, I said. When I found out I was pregnant with twins, Marcus and I were terrified and excited in equal measure. We had talked about children someday, but twins were unexpected and came earlier than we had planned. We needed support and encouragement as we adjusted to this new reality. I paused, letting them imagine what their response would have been if I had come to them at that moment. Marcus's parents were incredible. They listened to our concerns without judgment. They shared their own experiences with early parenthood. They offered practical help and emotional support. They made us feel capable and prepared even when we were scared. That is what I needed during that time, and that is what they provided. My voice softened as I continued. During my pregnancy, I continued my fieldwork through the first trimester, because I felt fine and my doctors cleared me for normal activities. In my second trimester, I reduced my field time and focused more on consulting work that I could do from home. By my third trimester, I was working entirely remotely, conducting impact assessments and writing reports while the twins grew. I had been enormously productive during my pregnancy, perhaps because I knew my work time would be more limited once the babies arrived. I had completed 6 major consulting projects, published 2 research papers, and made significant progress on a book manuscript about wolf conservation policy. My pregnancy had not derailed my career. It had simply required adaptation and careful time management. I went into labor 3 weeks early, which is common with twins. Marcus was with me the entire time. His parents arrived at the hospital within 2 hours. They were in the waiting room during the delivery, and they met Oliver and Stella within an hour of their birth. They brought food and practical supplies. They offered to stay at our house and help however we needed. They treated the whole experience as a joyful family event, rather than an opportunity to criticize or control. My mother flinched at this description, clearly recognizing that her response would have been dramatically different. She would have tried to take over, to manage everything according to her vision of how things should be done, to position herself as the expert whose wisdom I desperately needed rather than as a supportive presence offering help on my terms. The first 3 months were exhausting, I admitted. Twins are no joke, and even with Marcus as a full partner in childcare, we were both sleep-deprived and overwhelmed. But his parents helped with meals and laundry. My research colleagues adjusted deadlines to give me more flexibility. My consulting clients were understanding about my reduced availability. Everyone in my life who actually knew what was happening rallied to support us. And they had. The community I had built outside my family had proven its worth during those difficult early months. Friends brought meals. Colleagues covered parts of projects when I needed extra time. Marcus's parents stayed with us for 2 weeks after we brought the twins home, handling night feedings and laundry and cooking while Marcus and I learned how to care for 2 infants simultaneously. By 4 months we had found our rhythm, I continued. Marcus and I worked out a schedule where we alternated primary childcare responsibilities. When I had consulting deadlines, he took the lead with the twins. When he had surgeries or emergency calls, I adjusted my schedule to be home. We hired a part-time nanny to cover the hours when we both needed to work, and we built a life that accommodated both our professional ambitions and our commitment to hands-on parenting. It had not been easy, but it had been possible because we were both fully invested, and because we had support from people who respected our choices rather than questioning them at every turn. Oliver and Stella are thriving, I said, and my voice filled with genuine warmth as I talked about my children. They are healthy and hitting all their developmental milestones. Oliver is more laid back and observant, happy to watch the world go by from his bouncer seat. Stella is energetic and vocal, always demanding attention and interaction. They are starting to notice each other now, reaching out to touch hands and making sounds back and forth like they are having conversations we cannot understand. I pulled out my phone and navigated to my photos, turning it so those closest to me could see the screen. The most recent pictures showed 2 beautiful 7-month-old babies, Oliver with his serious dark eyes and Stella with her bright smile and wispy blonde hair. They were photographed in Marcus's arms in front of a Christmas tree, both wearing matching green outfits that his mother had bought for them. The phone was passed around the table, each person studying the images with expressions ranging from wonder to something that might have been grief at what they had missed. These were their grandchildren, niece and nephew, great-grandchildren. These were family members they should have known from birth but who were complete strangers because of the dysfunctional dynamics that had made me choose secrecy over inclusion. "They are beautiful," my grandmother whispered, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the photos. "Oh, Maya, they are absolutely beautiful." "They are," I agreed. "And they are loved and cared for by parents who are fully committed to giving them the best possible life, even if that life does not look exactly like what you think it should." This was the reality they had been missing, while they spent Thanksgiving dinner pitying me for my childless state and questioning when I would finally get my life together. I had my life together in ways they had never imagined because they had been too busy judging to actually look at what I was building. The photographs of Oliver and Stella continued their circuit around the table, each family member studying the images with varying degrees of emotion visible on their faces. My grandmother held the phone with trembling hands, zooming in on details as though trying to memorize every feature of the great-grandchildren she had not known existed until 15 minutes ago. My Aunt Susan wiped at her eyes discreetly, while my Uncle David simply stared at the screen with an expression that suggested he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about his niece's life. As I watched them absorb this evidence of my hidden reality, I felt something shift inside me. The anger that had propelled me through the initial revelation was giving way to a deeper, more complex sadness. Not regret for my choices, but rather grief for what might have been possible if my family had been different people, if they had been capable of offering the support and acceptance I had needed instead of the judgment and dismissal I had learned to expect. "You know what the hardest part was?" I said quietly, drawing their attention back from the photographs to my face. "It was not the physical exhaustion of pregnancy or the challenges of caring for newborn twins. It was the loneliness of going through one of the most significant experiences of my life, without being able to share it with my own mother." My mother's face crumpled at these words, fresh tears spilling down her already blotchy cheeks. But I was not trying to hurt her. I was simply naming the truth of what I had experienced, the emotional cost of the protection I had chosen. When I first saw those 2 heartbeats on the ultrasound screen and realized I was carrying twins, my immediate instinct was to call you Mom. I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. I wanted to hear your voice, to share that moment of shock and wonder with someone who had been through pregnancy herself, and would understand what I was feeling. But I stopped myself because I knew exactly how that conversation would go. I could see her about to protest, so I held up a hand to forestall the interruption. "You would have asked immediately whether Marcus and I were getting married now that children were involved. You would have expressed concern about how I would manage my career with twins. You would have suggested I move closer to you so you could help, which would really mean so you could supervise and criticize my choices more easily." Within 5 minutes of sharing the most exciting news of my life, I would have felt small and inadequate and like I had made a terrible mistake. The accuracy of this prediction was written across her face. She could not deny it because we both knew I was describing exactly what would have happened. The pattern was too established, too predictable. Her love for me had always been conditional on my conformity to her vision of who I should be, and my pregnancy would simply have provided new territory for that conditional love to operate within. "So instead of calling you, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the medical clinic and called Marcus," I said. "And he was perfect. He was shocked and scared and excited all at once, exactly the way I was. He did not question whether we were ready or whether this was a good idea. He just said we would figure it out together, and then he asked me how I was feeling and whether I wanted him to leave work early to be with me." The contrast between what Marcus had offered and what my mother would have provided could not have been more stark. One response centered my experience and feelings. The other would have centered her concerns and expectations. Throughout my pregnancy, there were so many moments when I wanted my mother, I admitted, and I saw hope flicker briefly in her eyes before I continued. "Not the mother I actually have, but the mother I wish I had. The one who would have been excited without being controlling. The one who would have offered support without judgment. The one who would have celebrated my choices instead of questioning them." My voice caught slightly on these words because speaking them aloud made the loss feel more real. I had grieved this imaginary supportive mother many times over the years, but never quite like this. Never with such clear awareness of exactly what I had missed by having to navigate pregnancy and early motherhood without maternal support. When I was 7 months pregnant and so uncomfortable I could barely sleep, I wanted to call you and complain about the back pain and the constant need to urinate and how hard it was to find clothes that fit, I said. But I knew that if I called, you would ask questions I did not want to answer about why you were only hearing about this now, and the conversation would become about your hurt feelings instead of about what I was experiencing. My mother was sobbing openly now, great heaving sobs that shook her shoulders. My father had moved his chair closer to hers and put his arm around her, but his eyes remained fixed on me with an expression that might have been the beginning of understanding. When I went into labor 3 weeks early and was terrified because I was not ready yet, I wanted my mother there. I continued relentlessly, because if I was going to expose this wound, I needed to expose all of it. I wanted someone who had been through childbirth to tell me I could do this, that my body knew what to do, that I was strong enough to bring these babies safely into the world. But Marcus's mother filled that role instead because she was the one I had trusted with the information that I was pregnant in the first place. The substitution of Marcus's mother for my own was perhaps the clearest indictment of our relationship. Another woman had stood in the gap my mother should have filled, had provided the support and encouragement that should have come from my own family, and she had done it willingly and joyfully, not because she had to but because she genuinely cared about my well-being and wanted to be helpful rather than controlling. When Oliver and Stella were born and they were placed on my chest for the first time, my heart felt like it might explode from how much I loved them instantly and completely, I said, my voice softening at the memory. And in that moment I understood for the first time exactly how conditional your love for me has always been, because I knew with absolute certainty that I could never love my children the way you have loved me. I could never make them feel the way you have made me feel. I could never value them only when they met my expectations and dismissed them when they chose differently. This realization had been profound and transformative. Becoming a mother had not just changed my relationship with my children. It had fundamentally altered my understanding of my relationship with my own mother, and the damage that relationship had done over the years. I looked at these two tiny perfect humans, and I made a promise to them right there in the delivery room. I continued. I promised that I would love them unconditionally, that I would celebrate who they are rather than trying to force them into predetermined molds, that I would support their dreams even if those dreams looked nothing like what I imagined for them. And I promised myself that I would never make them feel invisible the way you have made me feel for most of my adult life. The word invisible seemed to hit my mother like a physical blow. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, her face a mask of pain and confusion. Invisible, she repeated. How can you say you were invisible? We talked regularly. We saw each other at holidays. We have always been part of your life. You were physically present but you never actually saw me, I explained. You saw the version of me that existed in your imagination, the disappointing daughter who refused to follow the correct path. But you never saw who I actually am, what I have actually accomplished, what my life actually looks like. You were so busy comparing me to your expectations and finding me lacking that you never bothered to look at the reality in front of you. I turned to address the whole table rather than just my mother. All of you did this to varying degrees. You constructed a narrative about my life based on limited information and your own assumptions, and then you never questioned whether that narrative was accurate. You decided I was struggling financially, so you never asked about my actual income. You decided I was lonely and unfulfilled, so you never asked whether I was happy with my life. You decided I was avoiding adult responsibilities, so you never acknowledged the responsibilities I had actually taken on. Diane had been quiet for several minutes, but now she spoke up, her voice small and uncertain. I did not know you felt invisible. I thought we had a normal sibling relationship. Did you? I asked not unkindly. When was the last time you asked me a question about my life that was not immediately followed by advice about how I should change it? When was the last time you expressed genuine interest in my work or my relationships without using that information as ammunition to make yourself feel superior? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. We both knew the answer. Our relationship had not been normal or healthy for years. It had been defined by competition and comparison, with her cast as the winner and me as the loser in a game I had never agreed to play. The invisibility was not just about you failing to see my accomplishments, I said. It was about you failing to see me as a whole person with my own valid desires and choices. You saw only what I lacked according to your measurement system. You never saw what I had built or who I had become. I thought about the specific moments over the past 7 months when this invisibility had felt most acute. When Oliver had his first real smile at 6 weeks old and I had no one from my family to tell. When Stella had started rolling over at 4 months and I could not share that milestone with my mother. When both babies had begun eating solid foods and making the most hilarious disgusted faces at new flavors, and I had only Marcus's family to laugh with about it. Do you know what it is like to experience the most joyful moments of your life, and have no one from your family of origin to share them with? I asked. To watch your children hit developmental milestones, and know that your own parents do not even know these children exist? To feel so disconnected from your biological family that hiding an entire pregnancy feels safer than risking their involvement? These were rhetorical questions, but the pain behind them was real and raw. I had made the choice to exclude my family deliberately and for good reasons, but that did not mean the choice had been without cost. The loneliness of those months had been profound, even with Marcus's unwavering support and his family's warmth. Every time I saw a mother and daughter shopping together for baby supplies, I felt a pang of loss, I admitted. Every time I saw grandparents cooing over their grandchildren in the park, I wondered what it would have been like if my family had been different. Every time Marcus's mother offered to babysit so we could have a date night or brought over a meal she had prepared, I felt grateful and sad simultaneously because these should have been things my own mother did. My grandmother was shaking her head slowly, tears streaming down her weathered face. Maya, sweetheart, I would have done all those things if I had known. We all would have. Would you though? I asked gently. Or would your help have come with strings attached? Would you have prepared meals that met your standards and then criticized how I was feeding my babies? Would you have offered babysitting but only if I followed your instructions about sleep schedules and routines? Would you have bought baby supplies but only the ones you approved of rather than the ones I actually wanted? The questions hung in the air unanswered because we all knew the truth. Their help would have been conditional, provided only to the extent that I accepted their authority and deferred to their preferences. It would have been help designed to pull me back into conformity rather than support me in the choices I was already making. The emotional toll of invisibility is not just about what you miss in the moment, I said. It is about the cumulative effect over years of having your reality denied and your experiences dismissed. It is about slowly learning that the people who are supposed to love you most cannot be trusted with the most important parts of your life. I had not fully understood this toll until I experienced the contrast of being genuinely seen and supported by Marcus's family. His mother asked questions because she wanted to understand my perspective, not because she was looking for opportunities to offer correction. His father expressed interest in my work because he found it genuinely fascinating, not because he thought he should pretend to care. His siblings treated Marcus and me as equal partners in our relationship, rather than assuming he was somehow settling for a woman who refused to marry him properly. Being seen by Marcus's family showed me what I had been missing my entire life, I said. It showed me that families can celebrate unconventional choices instead of merely tolerating them. It showed me that support can be offered without judgment, and that love can be genuinely unconditional rather than just claimed to be. My father cleared his throat, clearly struggling with emotions he was not accustomed to processing or expressing. Maya, I need you to understand that we never intended to make you feel invisible or unsupported. We have always loved you and wanted the best for you. I believe you believe that, Dad, I said. But intention is not the same as impact. You may have intended to be loving and supportive, but the actual impact of your behavior was to make me feel constantly judged and found wanting. You may have wanted the best for me, but you defined the best according to your values rather than asking what I actually wanted for myself. This distinction between intention and impact was crucial, and I could see that at least some of them were beginning to grasp it. They had told themselves they were being good parents and family members because their intentions were good, never stopping to examine whether their actual behavior matched those intentions or produced the desired results. The invisibility created a wall between us, I continued. Every time you dismissed one of my accomplishments or compared me unfavorably to Diane or questioned my choices, you added another brick to that wall. Eventually the wall became so high that I could not see over it anymore, and I stopped trying. I stopped sharing. I stopped seeking your approval or validation. I built my life on the other side of that wall where you could not see it or touch it or damage it with your criticism. The metaphor was apartment. I had literally constructed a separate existence, one where my professional success and personal relationships, and now my children lived protected from the dysfunction of my family of origin. The wall had been necessary for my survival and sanity, but it had also ensured that my family remained ignorant of who I actually was and what I had actually accomplished. When you asked me tonight when I was going to give you grandchildren, you were speaking to me from one side of that wall, I said. You were addressing the imaginary Maya who lives in your minds, the one who is childless and struggling and disappointing. But the real Maya, the one who actually exists, was standing on the other side of that wall with 2 7-month-old babies you knew nothing about because you built that wall with your years of judgment and dismissal. My mother was still crying, but her tears had taken on a different quality now. These were not the performative tears she typically deployed when she wanted to position herself as the victim. These seemed more genuine, more connected to real grief over what had been lost between us. I am so sorry, she whispered. Maya, I am so sorry. I did not know. I did not understand. You did not know because you did not ask, I said, not cruelly but firmly. You did not understand because you never tried to understand. You decided who I was supposed to be, and when I turned out to be someone different, you chose disappointment over curiosity. You chose criticism over celebration. You chose your narrative over my reality. The indictment was complete and devastating. I had named not just individual incidents, but the entire pattern that had shaped our relationship for years. I had exposed the mechanisms by which they had made me feel invisible, and the cumulative toll that invisibility had taken on my willingness to include them in my life. The saddest part, I said quietly, is that you missed so much beauty and joy because you were too busy being disappointed to see what was actually in front of you. You missed the excitement of my pregnancy. You missed the miracle of birth. You missed the first 7 months of your grandchildren's lives. And you missed all of it not because I am cruel or vindictive, but because you created an environment where hiding felt safer than sharing. This was the emotional core of everything, the grief that sat beneath the anger. They had robbed themselves of these experiences through their own behavior, and they had robbed me of the maternal and familial support I should have been able to count on during one of the most vulnerable times of my life. We had all lost something valuable, and the responsibility for that loss lay primarily with them. The Thanksgiving dinner had transformed completely from its traditional beginning. The food sat forgotten and cold. The children were growing restless, and my family sat in the ruins of their assumptions, finally forced to confront the consequences of years of behavior they had never questioned or examined. But I was not finished yet. There was more they needed to understand before we could even begin to discuss what kind of relationship might be possible going forward. The invisibility I had experienced was painful, but it was only part of a larger pattern that included the elevation of Diane's choices and the systematic devaluation of my own. And that pattern needed to be addressed directly and completely. The silence that followed my last statement stretched uncomfortably long. My family sat processing the weight of what I had revealed, each person grappling with their own version of guilt, defensiveness, or dawning awareness. But there was another dimension to this dysfunction that needed addressing, one that sat directly across the table from me in the form of my older sister Diane, whose carefully constructed image of maternal perfection had been used as a weapon against me for years. I turned my attention fully to Diane, who had been uncharacteristically subdued since my initial revelation about the twins. She sat with her youngest daughter Sophia still balanced on her lap, though the baby had grown fussy and was pulling at her mother's necklace with increasing insistence. Diane's husband Nathan had one arm draped protectively across the back of her chair, as though he could shield her from the uncomfortable truths being spoken at this table. Diane, I said, my voice gentle but firm, we need to talk about your role in all of this. Her eyes widened slightly, a flash of defensive alarm crossing her features before she schooled them back into careful neutrality. My role? Maya, I have always tried to be supportive of you, even when I did not understand your choices. Have you? I asked. Because from where I sit, you have spent the better part of a decade using your conventional life choices as a cudgel to beat me with, sometimes overtly and sometimes through the more subtle method of accepting and amplifying mom and dad's favoritism without ever once questioning whether it was fair or healthy. Diane's face flushed red, anger and embarrassment mixing in her expression. That is not fair. I cannot control how mom and dad treat you. I cannot be held responsible for their reactions to your choices versus mine. You are right that you cannot control their behavior, I agreed. But you have actively participated in and benefited from the dynamic where your accomplishments are celebrated and mine are dismissed. You have never once stood up for me or suggested that maybe their treatment of me was unfair. Instead, you have accepted the pedestal they placed you on and looked down at me from that elevated position with a mixture of pity and superiority. The accusation hung in the air between us, sharp and undeniable. I watched her struggle with it, saw the denial forming on her lips before she caught herself and seemed to recognize that outright rejection of my claim would be impossible to sustain given the evidence of years of behavior. I never asked to be put on a pedestal, she said finally, her voice defensive but quieter than before. No, you did not ask for it, I acknowledged. But once you were there, you never questioned it either. You never examined whether the praise you received was proportional to your actual achievements, or whether it came partly at my expense. You accepted the narrative that your choices were correct and mine were questionable, and you used that narrative to feel better about yourself whenever you felt insecure. I thought about the countless moments when Diane had subtly or not so subtly positioned herself as the sister who had done everything right. The comments about my career being interesting but not practical. The observations about how hard it must be to maintain relationships when I traveled so much for work. The sympathetic looks when family members discussed my single status, as though being unmarried was a condition to be pitied rather than a choice to be respected. Do you remember my 30th birthday dinner 2 years ago? I asked, not waiting for her to respond before continuing. You gave a toast where you said you hoped that now that I was 30, I would finally figure out what I wanted from life the way you had figured it out by that age. You said it with a smile, and everyone laughed like it was a loving joke between sisters. But it was not a joke. It was a public announcement that you had achieved clarity and purpose while I was still floundering, and you packaged it as sisterly concern so that any objection on my part would make me look oversensitive. Diane's flush deepened. She clearly remembered the moment, though perhaps she had never examined it from my perspective before. I was trying to encourage you. I thought you seemed unsettled, and I wanted you to find the kind of happiness I had found. You assumed I was unsettled because my life did not look like yours, I corrected. You assumed that because I had not married and had children by 30, I must be unhappy or lost. It never occurred to you that I might be perfectly satisfied with my life, that I might have found happiness and purpose in my work and my relationship with Marcus and my gradual building toward the family I wanted rather than rushing into it on someone else's timeline. This was the fundamental error that Diane and the rest of my family kept making. They measured my life against their standards and found it wanting, never stopping to consider that I might be using entirely different metrics for success and fulfillment. They assumed unhappiness where none existed simply because my choices diverged from theirs. Your happiness has always been conditional on me being less happy, I said, watching her face carefully as the words landed. You have needed me to be the cautionary tale, the sister who chose wrong, because it makes your choices look better by comparison. Every time Mom and Dad praised you for your family while criticizing my career focus, you accepted that praise without discomfort because it reinforced your belief that you had made the right decisions. Nathan shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with this direct attack on his wife. Now wait just a minute. Diane has worked incredibly hard to build our family. She deserves recognition for that. Just because you made different choices does not mean hers should not be celebrated. You are absolutely right, I said, surprising him with my agreement. Diane does deserve recognition for the work she has put into raising 3 children and maintaining a household and supporting your career. That work is valuable and important, and it should be celebrated. But here is what you are missing. Celebrating Diane's choices does not require diminishing mine. Recognizing her accomplishments does not necessitate treating my accomplishments as less important or less valid. I turned back to Diane. The problem has never been that you receive praise and recognition. The problem is that the praise you receive is implicitly or explicitly framed as evidence that your path is superior to mine. Mom does not just say she is proud of you for having 3 children. She says she is proud of you for having 3 children while looking at me with disappointment that I do not. Dad does not just celebrate your family. He celebrates your family while questioning when I will start a real life. The distinction was crucial, And I could see from Diane's expression that she was beginning to understand it, perhaps for the first time. She had assumed that any criticism of how her accomplishments were celebrated was an attack on the accomplishments themselves, when in reality I was critiquing the framework that required my failure to validate her success. Do you know what it has been like to watch you be praised for things that are normal life milestones, while my objectively unusual achievements go unrecognized? I asked. You got married at 24, and it was treated like you had conquered Everest. I earned my doctorate at 28 after years of intensive research, and it was treated like I had finally finished an extended hobby project. You announced your first pregnancy, and the family threw you an elaborate baby shower. I bought a house worth nearly $1 million with money I earned through my own expertise, and nobody even knew because I had learned by that point that sharing good news with this family was an exercise in futility. The examples illustrated the profound imbalance in how our respective achievements were received and celebrated. Diane's conventional milestones, accomplished on a timeline that matched societal expectations, were treated as remarkable. My unconventional accomplishments, achieved through years of dedicated work in a competitive field, were barely acknowledged. I have never been jealous of your family or your choices, I said, wanting to be clear about this point. I have been angry about the double standard that makes your conventional path worthy of constant celebration, while my unconventional path is treated with skepticism and concern. I have been hurt by the implication that your way of building a life is the only valid way, and that my different approach represents failure rather than simply difference. Diane was crying now, quiet tears that slipped down her cheeks as she processed what I was saying. To her credit, she did not immediately deflect or deny. She sat with the discomfort of recognizing her complicity in a dynamic that had harmed her sister for years. I think part of me always knew the favoritism was not fair, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But it felt good to be the golden child, to be the one who made them proud. And I told myself that your feelings were not really hurt that badly, that you were strong enough not to need their approval the way I did. This confession was more honest than I had expected, and it revealed something I had not fully understood before. Diane had not been oblivious to the favoritism. She had been aware of it and had chosen to accept it because it served her emotional needs, while telling herself that I was somehow invulnerable to the harm it caused. I did need their approval, I said quietly. I just learned not to show it because showing vulnerability only invited more criticism. I taught myself to appear strong and independent, because that was the only way to survive in a family that seemed to view any need for emotional support as weakness. But that performance cost me. It cost me the ability to be authentic with my own family. It cost me the maternal support I desperately wanted during my pregnancy. And it cost you and me any chance of having a genuine sisterly relationship based on mutual respect rather than competition. The loss of that potential relationship was something I had grieved many times over the years. I had friends with sisters who were genuine confidants and supporters, women who celebrated each other's successes and provided comfort during struggles. I had always wanted that kind of relationship with Diane, but it had never been possible within the framework of favoritism and comparison that our parents had established and that she had been content to operate within. You called me 2 hours before I went into labor with the twins, I said, and I saw surprise register on Diane's face that I was mentioning this specific moment. Do you remember that conversation? She shook her head slowly, clearly not recalling a phone call that had been unremarkable to her but significant to me. You called to tell me about Emma's acceptance into an advanced reading program at school, I said. You were so excited, and you talked for 20 minutes about how proud you were, and how this proved that your focus on reading to her every night was paying off. I was happy for Emma because she is my niece and I want good things for her. But I was also sitting in my kitchen at 36 weeks pregnant with twins, terrified about the impending labor, and you never once asked how I was doing or what was happening in my life. The memory was vivid and painful. I had held the phone pressed to my ear, my free hand resting on my enormous belly, feeling the twins shifting and kicking inside me while my sister chattered on about her daughter's academic achievement, completely unaware that she was talking to someone who was about to become a mother herself within days. I could have told you right then, I continued. I could have said I am actually pregnant and terrified and could use some sisterly support. But I did not because I knew from experience that if I shared that information, the conversation would immediately shift to you expressing shock, and asking questions that would make me feel judged rather than supported. So I congratulated you on Emma's achievement and got off the phone as quickly as I could, and I went into labor 6 hours later without anyone in my biological family knowing it was happening. Diane was openly sobbing now, her shoulders shaking with the force of her emotion. Nathan had pulled her closer, but he was looking at me with an expression that suggested he was seeing me clearly for the first time and recognizing that his wife's version of family dynamics had been missing some crucial perspectives. I am not telling you this to be cruel, I said gently. I am telling you because you need to understand the real cost of the favoritism you benefited from and never questioned. You need to understand that your comfort in being the golden child came at the expense of my feeling perpetually inadequate and invisible. You need to understand that the pedestal you stood on was built on the foundation of my diminishment. My Aunt Susan, who had been silent for a long stretch, cleared her throat tentatively. Maya, I think we are all beginning to understand that the family dynamics were more harmful than we realized. But what do you want from us now? What would make this right? It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself for months as I navigated new motherhood, while maintaining my decision to exclude my family from that experience. What did I want? What would repair or at least improve a relationship that had been damaged by years of accumulated hurt? I want acknowledgement, I said, speaking to the whole table but still looking primarily at Diane. I want recognition that the way I have been treated was not okay, that it was not just oversensitivity on my part or me being difficult. I want people to stop defending the behavior by claiming good intentions when the impact was harmful regardless of intent. I paused, gathering my thoughts before continuing. And I want fundamental change in how this family operates. I want my accomplishments to be celebrated with the same enthusiasm that Diane's accomplishments receive. I want my choices to be respected even when they diverge from what you think I should do. I want questions asked out of genuine curiosity rather than as preludes to advice I did not request. I want to be seen as a complete person with my own valid path rather than as a problem to be fixed or a disappointment to be managed. These were not small requests. They required my family to examine and change patterns that had been operating for decades. They required my parents to confront their own biases about what constitutes a successful life for a woman. They required Diane to give up the comfortable position of being the favored daughter and accept a more equitable relationship with her sister. Most importantly, I added, I want my children to grow up in a family that celebrates diversity of choices rather than enforcing conformity. I want Oliver and Stella to see that there are many valid ways to build a meaningful life. I want them to be encouraged to follow their own passions and interests rather than pressured to meet predetermined expectations. And I want them to witness healthy relationships between adults who respect each other's differences rather than constantly judging and comparing. This was perhaps the most important point of all. My willingness to even consider rebuilding relationships with my family was contingent on their ability to provide a healthier environment for my children than they had provided for me. I would not subject Oliver and Stella to the same dynamics that had shaped my childhood and adolescence. If my family could not change, then the wall I had built would remain firmly in place, protecting my children from the dysfunction I had experienced. Diane, you have 3 children who are watching how you interact with me and learning from that example, I said, addressing my sister directly again. Emma, Lucas, and Sophia will develop their understanding of family relationships partly based on what they observe between us. Do you want them to learn that love is conditional on conformity? Do you want them to internalize that their worth depends on meeting expectations rather than being authentically themselves? Do you want them to grow up competing with each other for parental approval rather than supporting each other's different paths? These questions clearly struck a nerve. Diane's protective instincts toward her own children were strong, and I could see her considering how the family dynamics that had affected us might eventually affect them as well. I never thought about it that way, she admitted quietly. I never considered that Emma and Lucas might be absorbing messages about whose choices are valued and whose are not. I never thought about how our relationship might be modeling either healthy or unhealthy family dynamics for them. Well, they are absorbing those messages, I said. Children are incredibly perceptive. They notice who gets praised and who gets criticized. They observe whose achievements are celebrated and whose are dismissed. They internalize the values that adults demonstrate through their behavior, rather than just the values adults claim to hold. And right now, what they are learning is that traditional choices are good and unconventional choices are questionable, which will limit their ability to explore their own authentic paths as they grow older. This framing seemed to shift something in Diane's understanding. She had been able to rationalize that her own comfort with the favoritism was acceptable, because I was supposedly strong enough not to need equal treatment. But she could not rationalize exposing her children to unhealthy dynamics that would constrain their development and damage their relationships with each other. "I do not want that for my kids," she said, her voice firmer now despite the tears still streaming down her face. "I do not want Emma to grow up thinking she has to choose between career ambitions and family. I do not want Lucas to learn that there is only one acceptable path to masculinity or success. And I definitely do not want Sophia to internalize that her worth depends on conforming to traditional expectations for women. Then you need to be part of changing how this family operates," I said. "You cannot just passively benefit from favoritism while hoping your children somehow avoid learning the lessons that favoritism teaches. You need to actively push back when mom and dad praise you in ways that implicitly diminish me. You need to celebrate my accomplishments with genuine enthusiasm, rather than finding subtle ways to undermine them. You need to model for your children what it looks like to respect and support someone whose life choices look different from your own." The responsibility I was placing on Diane was significant, but it was also fair. She had been the beneficiary of the dysfunctional dynamic. She had the most to lose if the dynamic changed, and she no longer occupied the pedestal of being the favored daughter. But she also had the most power to influence change precisely because she had credibility and capital with our parents that I had never possessed. "I know this is hard to hear," I said, my voice softening slightly. "I know it feels like I am attacking you when I am trying to illuminate patterns that have harmed both of us in different ways. You may have been on the pedestal, but pedestals are not comfortable places to live. They require constant performance and maintenance. They create pressure to be perfect rather than authentic. And they isolate you from genuine connection because relationships built on favoritism and comparison are not relationships built on truth." I could see Diane considering this perspective, perhaps recognizing for the first time that being the golden child came with its own costs even as it provided certain benefits. The pressure to maintain her image of perfection, to keep producing the conventional milestones that earned praise, to never admit struggle or doubt because that might threaten her favored status. These were real constraints on her ability to live authentically. "I have been terrified of failing," Diane admitted suddenly, the words tumbling out as though she had been holding them back for years. "Terrified of not being perfect, of disappointing mom and dad the way they always said you disappointed them. I have shaped my entire life around maintaining their approval because I saw what happened to you when you lost it, and I could not imagine surviving that kind of constant criticism and disappointment." This confession revealed the fear that had motivated much of Diane's behavior, and it created a more complete picture of how the family dysfunction had affected both of us. I had been harmed by being cast as the disappointing daughter. She had been harmed by the pressure to be the perfect daughter. Neither role had allowed us to be fully human, fully ourselves. "So we have both been trapped," I said. "Just in different cages. And the only way out is to dismantle the whole system that created those cages in the first place." The revelation of Diane's own constraints within the family system seemed to shift the energy at the table. What had begun as my confrontation of their treatment had evolved into something more complex, a recognition that the dysfunction had enveloped all of us in different ways. But the architects of this system, the ones who had constructed and maintained the framework of conditional love and comparative judgment, had yet to fully reckon with their responsibility for what they had created. I turned my attention to my parents, who had been relatively quiet during my exchange with Diane. My mother had composed herself somewhat, though her eyes remained red and her expression haunted. My father sat rigidly upright in his chair, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that suggested he was working hard to maintain control over emotions he preferred not to examine too closely. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice steady but weighted with years of accumulated observations, "we need to talk about how you created and sustained the dynamic that has damaged both of your daughters in different ways." My father bristled visibly at the word damaged. His instinct toward defensiveness immediately activated. "Now Maya, I think that is an overstatement. Every family has its challenges and differences of opinion. That does not mean anyone has been damaged." "Does it not?" I asked. Your older daughter just admitted that she has spent her entire adult life terrified of disappointing you, shaping every major decision around maintaining your approval, rather than discovering what she actually wants for herself. Your younger daughter kept an entire pregnancy and the first 7 months of her children's lives secret from you because she knew with certainty that your involvement would cause more harm than good. If those outcomes do not suggest that something in your parenting approach has been damaging, then I do not know what would. The bluntness of this assessment left my father momentarily speechless. He was not accustomed to having his parenting directly questioned or criticized. In his worldview, parents were authority figures whose decisions and behaviors were to be respected by their children, not analyzed or challenged. The idea that he might bear responsibility for relationship difficulties with his adult daughters was not something he had seriously considered before this moment. My mother found her voice first, though it emerged thin and defensive. We have always done what we thought was best for both of you. We have always wanted you to be happy and successful. If our methods were not perfect, well, no parent is perfect. You cannot hold us accountable for every mistake we made while trying to raise you properly. I am not asking you to be perfect, I said, keeping my voice level despite the frustration her deflection provoked. I am asking you to acknowledge that your definition of properly raising us included some deeply problematic patterns that had lasting negative effects. I am asking you to recognize that good intentions do not excuse harmful behavior, and that claiming to want our happiness while actively undermining our ability to make our own choices is contradictory at best. I leaned forward slightly, making sure they could see my face clearly and understand that I was not speaking from a place of temporary anger or overreaction, but rather from a place of long-considered analysis and carefully articulated truth. Let me be specific about what I mean, I continued. From the time we were children, you established a framework where Diane's choices were consistently valued more highly than mine, not because her choices were objectively better, but because they aligned more closely with your preconceived notions of what girls should want and how women should live their lives. My mother started to protest, but I held up a hand to forestall the interruption. When Diane was 12 and wanted to join the cheerleading squad, you celebrated that choice and drove her to every practice and attended every game. When I was 12 and wanted to join the science club and spend weekends volunteering at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, you expressed concern that I was spending too much time alone and not developing proper social skills. The message was clear. Diane's traditionally feminine interests were good and healthy. My less conventional interests were concerning and needed to be redirected. The specific example seemed to land with particular force, perhaps because it illustrated how early the pattern had begun. This was not a dynamic that had emerged in my adulthood. It had been operating since childhood, shaping how both Diane and I understood our worth and our place in the family hierarchy. When we were teenagers, the pattern intensified, I said. Diane dated boys you approved of, boys from good families with college aspirations and conventional goals. I dated a boy who wanted to be a wildlife filmmaker, and you told me he was wasting his potential, and that I should focus on finding someone more stable and practical. Never mind that he was passionate and talented and treated me with respect. What mattered to you was that his ambitions did not fit your template for acceptable life paths. My father shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering the young man in question. Daniel had been my high school boyfriend, someone I had cared about deeply, and who had shared my passion for conservation and environmental protection. My parents had treated him with barely concealed disdain, making it clear that they considered him an unsuitable match for me. When we eventually broke up during my first year of college, my mother had expressed relief rather than sympathy for my heartbreak. The pattern continued through college and into our adult lives, I said. Every choice Diane made that aligned with traditional expectations received enthusiastic support. Every choice I made that diverged from that template received skepticism or outright criticism. Diane chose to major in elementary education, and you praised her for choosing a practical career that would allow flexibility for future family responsibilities. I chose to major in wildlife biology, and you questioned whether I would be able to find employment and suggested I might want to consider teaching instead as a backup plan. These parallel examples illustrated the systematic nature of the favoritism. It was not random or occasional. It was a consistent pattern of valuing conformity over authenticity, of prioritizing conventional markers of success over individual passion and talent. After college, when Diane got engaged to Nathan at 23, you were overjoyed. You threw them an elaborate engagement party and helped plan a wedding that cost more than my entire graduate school education. When I told you at 26 that I was applying to doctoral programs to continue my research on wolf conservation, you asked me when I was going to stop being a professional student and start thinking about my real future. The financial disparity was something I had not mentioned before, but it was relevant to understanding the depth of the favoritism. My parents had been willing to invest tens of thousands of dollars in celebrating Diane's wedding, viewing it as money well spent on an important life milestone. But they had questioned my decision to pursue advanced education, treating it as an expensive indulgence rather than an investment in my professional development. You paid for Diane's wedding, but you did not offer to help with my education, I said, stating the fact without accusation but also without softening. You felt that supporting her choice to marry was important, but supporting my choice to pursue expertise in my field was not. The message was unmistakable. The life path you valued deserved financial support. The life path I chose did not. My mother's face flushed with a combination of shame and defensiveness. We offered to help you if you needed it. You never asked for money. I never asked because I knew that any financial support would come with strings attached, I explained. It would come with increased pressure to justify my choices, with questions about when I was going to finish school and get a real job, with suggestions that I should be focusing on finding a husband instead of earning another degree. I chose to fund my education through fellowships and research assistantships and eventually through consulting work because that allowed me to make my own choices without having to constantly defend them to you. This decision had been strategic and necessary for my independence, but it had also meant that I had struggled financially during my graduate years in ways that Diane had never experienced. While she had lived comfortably as a newlywed with my parents' financial assistance for her wedding and regular gifts that helped with their early expenses, I had been living on a stipend that barely covered rent and groceries, wearing second-hand clothes and skipping meals to afford books and research materials. The financial favoritism was just one manifestation of the broader pattern, I continued. At every stage of our lives, you have sent the clear message that Diane's choices are worthy of celebration and material support, while mine are questionable and must be justified. When she bought her first house with Nathan, you gave them money for furniture and helped with the down payment. When I bought my house with Marcus, you did not know about it because I had learned by that point not to share major life events with you. My father finally spoke, his voice gruff with discomfort. We helped Diane and Nathan because they needed help. They were young and just starting out. You clearly did not need help if you could afford to buy a house on your own. That is an interesting rationalization, I observed. But it avoids the real issue. You helped Diane because you valued and approved of what she was doing. You did not help me because you did not approve of my choices, and the fact that I managed to succeed anyway without your help does not change the underlying dynamic of conditional support based on conformity to your expectations. The distinction was important. Financial support in itself was not the issue. The issue was that support was offered or withheld based on whether our choices aligned with my parents' values, creating a system where love and assistance were conditional on compliance, rather than freely given based on need or relationship. Let me ask you both a question, I said, looking between my parents. Can you name 3 significant accomplishments I have achieved in my professional life? The silence that followed was telling. My mother looked at my father, who looked back at her, both of them clearly struggling to recall specific details about my career achievements. They knew in vague terms that I worked with wolves and that I did consulting, but the specifics of my publications, my advisory board positions, my conference presentations, my documentary appearance, these details had never registered as important enough to remember. You published something about wolves, my mother offered tentatively. And you mentioned consulting work. I have published 17 peer-reviewed research papers, I said quietly. I have presented at 12 national and international conferences. I serve on 2 state conservation advisory boards that influence wildlife policy affecting millions of acres of habitat. I was featured in a documentary that was nominated for an Environmental Film Award. My consulting work has influenced development decisions that will shape ecosystem health for decades. But you cannot name any of this specifically because you have never asked and never paid attention when I tried to tell you. The contrast with their detailed knowledge of Diane's life was stark and undeniable. They could describe Emma's reading level and Lucas's soccer achievements, and the exact square footage of Diane's house, and the details of Nathan's latest promotion. They knew these things because they asked about them regularly and celebrated them enthusiastically. They did not know the equivalent details about my life because they had never invested the same interest or attention. Now let me ask you this, I continued. When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Without having some other agenda or piece of news to share about Diane or extended family? Again, silence. My parents exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unable to recall such a call because it had not happened in recent memory. Our communication had been perfunctory and functional, limited to logistics around holiday gatherings and brief exchanges, where they shared family news that I was expected to respond to appropriately. You call Diane several times a week, I said. I know this because she has mentioned it. You are involved in her daily life, interested in the small details of her routine, invested in her children's activities and achievements. You call me every few weeks, usually to inform me of family plans or to pass along information you think I should know. You do not call to hear about my life because you are not actually interested in my life unless it involves news that I am finally conforming to your expectations. This pattern of differential communication was another manifestation of the favoritism. The frequency and quality of contact communicated clearly which daughter my parents valued, and which they viewed as a disappointing obligation to maintain minimal connection with. The most painful part of all of this, I said, my voice softening with genuine sadness, is that you genuinely seem to believe you have been fair and loving to both of your daughters equally. You have convinced yourselves that your intentions were good, and that any problems in our relationships are the result of my oversensitivity or difficult personality, rather than your systematic favoring of one child over another based on how well we conform to your expectations. My mother was crying again, but these tears felt different from her earlier ones. There was less self-pity in them and more genuine grief over what she was beginning to recognize she had lost through her own behavior. Maya, I never meant to make you feel less valued than your sister, she said, her voice breaking. I love both of you. I have always loved both of you. I believe you love us both, I said gently. But love without respect and interest and genuine celebration of who we actually are rather than who you want us to be is insufficient. Love that requires conformity to earn full expression is conditional love, regardless of what you call it. And conditional love creates the exact dynamics we are discussing now. Where one daughter hides her pregnancy and excludes her parents from her children's lives, because she has learned through repeated experience that their involvement will be harmful rather than helpful. The reality of what they had lost through their behavior was beginning to sink in for both of my parents. They had missed my pregnancy. They had missed the births of their grandchildren. They had missed 7 months of Oliver and Stella's lives. These were losses that could never be recovered, moments that had passed forever while they remained ignorant because I had chosen protection over inclusion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.